tonight as we're talking about who Gnostics are, where they're coming from, why did they come up with all of the ideas they have. So I'll just kind of point out that so as we're getting to this time period when the Gnostics are going to be around, which is, let's say, in the century leading up to Jesus, and then the next, let's say, 3 or 4 centuries after that, people are realizing that when they are taking the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, and you read it literally, you're going to run into some complications or problems. You know, there's going to be some interpretations that you may not like if you're reading it literally. There is also increasingly an interest in and an awareness of ideas like the problem of evil, so which is to say, why do good things happen to bad people? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And also, in general, the question about, well, what is the meaning of life? There's also, I want to look at how, for example, when there's all of these different influences that come together, so the Second Temple Judaism as exposed to Zoroastrianism, which is the state religion of the Persian Empire, in which Judaism, Jerusalem is a province of the Persian Empire. That influences such things as the Apocalyptic movement, so the idea of seeing an imminent end of the world, and also the dualism, the physical dualism that Zoroaster taught, that essentially there is a cosmic good and a cosmic evil. These are kind of introduced into Second Temple dualism, but also then if you are in, in that area which then is conquered by Alexander the Great and is exposed to Greek ideas, now suddenly the same area has to contend with Greek dualism, which is this matter and non-matter, material and immaterial dualism, for example, that is so formulated by Plato. So we'll look at all those things. These is just kind of a preview of one of the things we're looking at. And then finally, for people who have become Christian, so people who are in the Christian community, so this isn't true for the various Jewish Gnostics that, for example, reject Christianity or reject Jesus, but for anybody who is becoming a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, then they also have to reconcile essentially how does Jesus relate to God. So if we are all, for example, monotheists, and increasingly even the pagans were philosophically monotheist or at least maybe dualists. If we're monotheists or dualists, how do we understand essentially if God is God and there's this Jesus guy, is Jesus God? How do we formulate that and work that out? And so the Gnostics have their own way of formulating that as well, or actually multiple ways. So just to kind of roll back and look at some of the inheritance. And so if you are part of the vast, let's say, Greek-speaking Jewish community in Egypt, and indeed the Jewish community in, let's say, the 1st century AD in Alexandria was larger there than any other place, so including any place that would have been in Judea, any individual place. And so one of the things, I'm going to be quoting here from the Brick Testament because it's one of my favorite iterations of one of my favorite translations of the Bible, but essentially it's one that's animated with or illustrated with using little Lego guys. So God, if we go back to some of the stories as portrayed in the early part or in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament for the Christians isn't always acting in ways that we might think of as being good, if we think of God as being all good. So we know for a bunch of different things, right? In the Noah story, so in Genesis 6:12 through 13, God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth, and God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence. Because of them, now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. So this is sometimes hard to square away with the God who is all good. He's going to destroy everything. And indeed, in the story, God destroys everyone and everything that's not on the ark, which is always why the fact that this particular Noah's Ark story becomes a kid's story always seems pretty pretty strange, right? Because anyway, kids like animals and rainbows and things like that, but there is a dark side to the story as well, right? Another example, as written anyway, we talked before about maybe the background and origins of the story of Abraham and Isaac, but as it's written in Genesis, it reads, "After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham,' and Abraham said, 'Here I am.' God said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I'll show you.'" So even though in the story, ultimately, an angel prevents Abraham from actually killing his son, and instead they substitute a ram for the offering, nevertheless, the way the story is written, at least as a test here, God is ordering something quite horrific. Another example. So the part of the tale is that God is giving to his people a promised land, but the way they're going to get it is actually that God is specifically ordering them to massacre everybody who already lives there and kill all of them. So an example just happens actually very frequently throughout the entire text, but there's an example in the book of Joshua. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed over to you the king of Ai, with his people, his city, his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king." So previously they'd actually massacred and killed everybody in the city of Jericho. And so only its spoil and livestock you may take as a booty for yourselves, so as opposed to in Jericho where they just killed and destroyed everything. And so set an ambush against the city behind it. And so in this particular story, God has helped them plan out how they're going to do it. They pretend that they're coming up as an army, and when everybody from Ai, all of the warriors all leave and to confront the Israelites run away and pretend, they do a feint. And when everybody runs away, then the people that are coming to ambush go into the undefended city and kill all of they burn it to the ground, and they ultimately slaughter all of the people in it. So the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out your sword that is in your hand towards Ai, for I will give it into your hand." All Israel returned to Ai, attacked it with the edge of the sword. The total of those who fell that day, both men and women, 12,000, all the people of Ai. Another example we have is, for example, in the book of Job. The Lord says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." So the guy, according to God, is completely blameless and upright. And he then points out to Satan, this is actually already as they've had a wager about whether or not if Job is just liking God because God has been blessing him. Satan has said, if you take all these things away from him, he'll curse you. He still persists in his integrity, God says, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. So God in the text here is saying that here we're taking a person who's perfectly righteous and blameless, and for no reason killing all of his family and livestock and all of it, and his property and his health, and destroying it all, that kind of a thing. So anyway, this problem in the reading, if we were reading this all literally, if we thought of these as historic events that actually happened, and we have just a very big surface reading, this has caused a lot of people, including very much so the Jewish people, whose scriptures these are, a bunch of different conflicts. And there's all kinds of different solutions to these readings, and we've read and done lectures on several before. So for example, last fall we had a lecture on Philo of Alexandria, who is a very important Jewish philosopher, Greek-speaking philosopher in Alexandria at this time, who really explains that these stories aren't to be understood literally, that they're metaphors, and that these don't express how God actually is. And this is, in fact, the window that a lot of early Christian groups also take and the way they go forward with it. But in any event, if you do go back, as modern fundamentalists do, and read these quite literally, the conclusions that you might jump to are fairly stark in terms of your understanding of whether this God is actually good or not. Okay, so I want to go to a window into the Gnostics and look at some of the Gnostic texts that are written around, anyway, in this kind of time period, and about how the Gnostics are understanding and rewriting their version of the scriptures. So there is a Gnostic sacred story written into a book called the Apocryphon of John, or Secret Book of John, and this is so therefore attributed to the Apostle John, John the Beloved, and supposedly, according to this text anyway, John is told this directly from Jesus. So Jesus, who is his very, anyway, beloved companion, has given him this secret knowledge. The text then retells the creation story of Genesis in a very complex, and I was going to say esoteric detail, and in so doing explains like how the entire cosmos both was created, but how it exists and what its purpose for, and it also then thereby explains essentially the meaning of life as understood by Gnostic Christians like the author of this text. So here's a little bit of this text. And I, which is to say John, since this is written in John the Beloved's first person, asked to know it, and he, which is to say Jesus, said to me, "The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is he who exists as God and Father of everything." So we've introduced here a new word that the Gnostics are going to understand, how they understand what God the Father, and they're using the word monad. God the Father of everything is the indivisible one who is above everything, who exists as incorruption, which is in the pure light into which no eye can look. He is invisible, the invisible spirit of whom it is not right to think of him as a God or as something similar, for he is more than a God. For he does not exist in something inferior to him, since everything exists in him, for it is he who establishes himself. He is eternal, since he does not need anything, for he is total perfection. And so, we've kind of have done a bunch of different study of both of Greek philosophy, and so of Platonism and also Aristotle's ideas. Some of these are going to sound kind of familiar to us. So this idea that, for example, he doesn't need anything, and everything is everything's inferior to him. Everything exists in him, but not he in anything else. So in other words, these are ideas like the source of everything, the unmoved mover, the ineffable. It's something that's even beyond what ancient Greeks or anyone else would have thought of as a God, because we're talking about the singular one from which everything comes. Total perfection, the monad. Okay. So, as we continue on to understand, though, what happens, how do we have a universe out of the monad? And so, the monad's thought, so as this singular being has thought, that thought itself performed a deed and she came forth. So now we have that first thought, which is forethought from his mind. She is the forethought, and this is now what using the term anyway, the Gnostics are going to call it the barbelo, so one of the most important emanations from God, the unknowable, infinite, ineffable God. Now there's going to be a series of additional divine beings, and one of these, or the first of these, is the barbelo of all. Her light shines like his light, the perfect power, which is in the image of the invisible virginal spirit who is perfect. And so from then this first thought, there then emanate a series of additional emanations, and these are paired aeons, and aeons just means divine beings who emanate from the monad. And they're like forethought, thought, indestructibility, eternal life, truth, and they're paired because in this understanding of the cosmos, essentially each one of these has a gender, and so there's a male and a female together. And this is showing that the universe is not only has total order, but is completely balanced. And so that all happens. Then the word of creation, the logos, comes forward, and the word of creation is Christ, the autogenes. So this thing that is now going to generate all, the rest of creation, comes forth. And then the last of the aeons, usually in different tellings, but in this one, especially in the Apocryphon of John, is wisdom, or Sophia. And so Sophia is Greek for wisdom and is a female or is a feminine noun, and so therefore is often viewed as a goddess or a female and paired with a male in this case because it's an aeon. And Sophia of the epinoia, so divine revelation, wisdom, being an aeon, conceived a thought for herself. She wanted to bring forth a likeness out of herself without the consent of the Spirit he had not approved, and without her consort. So now she is doing the thing that the original monad did, that first thought, creative thought, but she's doing it without her male consort as a pairing, and she's doing it also without the permission of the monad. And so anyway, this sort of hasty or reckless attempt to know ultimate truth that even wisdom is trying to have, this is going to be what causes all the problems in the universe as far as the Gnostics are concerned. And so the result of wisdom's unauthorized conception is that now she emanates a being who is a flawed God. And that being in the Apocryphon in John is named the Yaldabaoth. And the secret now, and this is like a secret knowledge that John is giving in the Apocryphon, is that now Yaldabaoth, who goes on to enact the Genesis story and creates the flawed material world, is that this Yaldabaoth then becomes the Yahweh of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. And so therefore, all of those things that we read about God doing, at the beginning of this, the simple answer that the Gnostics here have is, well, that's because that's not God at all who has been operating this way. This is in fact a false material God who thinks he's God, but who is actually acting in very evil ways. But there is in fact the true God, the monad, that it is existing not in the physical plane, but in this holy spiritual plane. And so anyway, if you guys wanted to know what the secret the Gnostics have been holding on to was, that's the big one, right there. So, yeah. Erja.
I have a question about the monads. I think Leibniz is using the same monad for explaining his pantheistic worldview. Is he using this as a source material?
So yeah, the question is, well, we should do Leibniz's. We're going to have to do a lecture on Leibniz eventually because he's so interesting. That modern philosopher, who is also one of the co-creators of calculus, also has a very abstruse philosophy of his own of how he's he understands the universe, which is in a lot of ways a reply to the challenge of Descartes and how, kind of the mind-body problem that Descartes has. And so Leibniz he uses the same word monad to create a sense that I think every single individual thing in the universe is a monad that that can't interact or connect with each other, and it's only the spirit of God that is actually causing any cause and effect between monads. And so I may be getting Leibniz's, it's a very complicated idea what he has, and I have to study it again to be reminded of exactly what it is. I would say it's a completely different use of the idea of the monad than this, except for in a sense that because there's lots and lots of monads in Leibniz's understanding, whereas in this case we're talking about the one singularity that is at the beginning of everything. And so it's the same. I mean, we're drawing on Greek, right? So it means something where oneness. And so all of the little onenesses, I think, are individual in Leibniz, whereas we're talking about there's only one in this case, right? So the monad is the only monad in Gnosticism. Also, Gnosticism is, this text that I'm reading from, it's only been rediscovered in the 20th century. Leibniz didn't have any access to it, so he wouldn't have been able to read it. Okay, so So this is, in the sense then, a solution to like all of these kinds of, there is a solution to these kind of problems, which is to say gnosis. So for the author of the Apocryphon of John, this state of affairs, the fact that all of creation, all of the material world has been created by a flawed God who has all this power over us and who sometimes tries to wipe us out with a flood and et cetera, all those kind of things. No worries, because in fact, there is a solution to all of this. So the material world has come about through ignorance of the true God, the monad. The true God is the monad. In fact, as we've just said, that God is so ineffable that we should even call him a God, and we shouldn't actually call him he, because transcends gender, there's none of those things. Humans, however, can return to that spiritual realm from which a particle within us is all emanated through gnosis or knowledge. So in the same way that ignorance and error is what got us into this undesirable situation to begin with, knowledge is what's going to pull us out of it. And so part of that knowledge for the Gnostics now who become Christians, including the author of the Apocryphon of John, this whole thing is a revelation from Jesus to John, is going to involve Jesus. So for some Gnostic Christians, Jesus then is the incarnation of the logos of the monad. So the monad speaks a word, and that word at creation, let there be light, that portion of the Genesis story, that becomes Christ. And so for some of them, Jesus is actually incarnated in flesh in order to lead us out of where we're at and give us this kind of gnosis and secret knowledge. But for others, they're like, I don't even think that the logos that Christ could ever have really been in a body, because flesh is so corrupt. He must have just been seeming to be a real person. He's actually just a spiritual being the entire time, and everybody was simply tricked by an apparition. And so they're kind of on the fence about this. So several of the different Gnostics have those different ideas. But either way, for the closest followers, for the people that have been brought into the secret knowledge of the Gnostics, so people who, they may well be in a regular Christian congregation, and then somebody kind of comes up and says, hey, that was a great sermon that the bishop gave about resurrection of the souls and things like that. We have a study group that meets on Wednesday or Tuesday night. Do you want to come over to our study group? Because we've got some, you'll want to hear from, what this guy, what our teacher has to say, because we've got some real good insights on that. And so they will essentially, within the congregations of what would be otherwise really quite ordinary Orthodox Christians, maybe, there would be like an interior group that has some of these texts that talks about them, shares them, and in fact probably participates in special rituals that are designed to allow the person not only to have gnosis in terms of intellectual knowledge, but to have gone through several kinds of rituals that bring you into a place where you can experience oneness with spirit, is the idea. So what they want to be able to do then is to have a direct experience of gnosis or knowledge of the monad, as opposed to something that is either where there's something in between, right? So as you are like only, for example, participating through the church's sacraments or through the intercession of a saint or something like that, you are now going to actually directly experience oneness with the true Creator. So how is it accomplished? So it's accomplished especially through knowing yourself. And so what you are essentially doing is, on the one hand, a process of intellectual introspection, because, and one of the reasons why they tell these long creation stories of all these emanations is because they are arguing, or they believe, that your own mind and the mind of humans are actually made in image of this creation process. And so this long mythology or long creation story that's talking about how truth or other aeons are emanated out from the ineffable source, that works in the same way as how essentially your mind works. And so as you know yourself better, as you go through an intellectual process of introspection, and as you meditate on increasingly abstract philosophical principles, then you are going to get to a place where you can achieve a state of mystical union with the one, with the monad. Did you have a question or comment?
Yeah.
Can we get you get the microphone so that people can hear online too?
About Jesus being the incarnation of the Logos, of the Word.
Yes.
So, and from that perspective, was he what happened before? Was he the unique incarnation of the Word, or was he like another incarnation following some kind of sequence? So, like, was there some kind of switch, some kind of novelty with Jesus according to that perspective, or but what happened before that, if that was the novelty?
Right.
Yeah.
So, there's a novel switch.
Okay.
So essentially, there's and this is actually not totally divergent from Orthodox Christianity either, let's say. So there is in this theology, there's a pre-existent Jesus. So Jesus is one of these original eons, because Jesus is the Word of God, the Logos, so one of these very important early emanations of the monad. But then what's happened all the way up until Jesus comes to earth is that nobody has that knowledge of the monad to come back. And so by coming to earth and experiencing or seeming to experience all the things that Jesus does, he's essentially tricked the Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth has, and his servants have killed Jesus's body, or seemed to. But in fact, actually, while he was there, he was able to impart this gnosis to the disciples, who are now able to spread it to us, so that we now can achieve a salvation that is a salvation of knowledge. So that's what's changed. And so it's not wholly different. It's just that in the sense that for Orthodox Christianity, Jesus is also the Logos, but is not an emanation. Instead, Jesus is a second person of God, where as opposed to being an emanation of, when there's a theological distinction. And then also that something else is operative in terms of the incarnation and atonement of Jesus than simply imparting gnosis or knowledge, because knowledge is not, because the problem in the world is not simply ignorance in Orthodox Christianity. So that would be the distinction. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple examples to show how this works and how this varies from traditional Christianity as well. So one of the the most important texts that we have from the Gnostics is called the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is probably written in multiple different stages, and the earliest text may well not have too much to do with the Gnostics, but we don't know, because what we have is a version of the text that's later and that has elements that we might call Gnosticizing. It's not the same kind of Gnostics that wrote the Apocryphon of John, but they have similar kinds of ideas, and we'll just see that, okay? So if that gospel starts, it says, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded." And so we can already see that at the title of this is sort of how the other one worked too, when we were looking at the Apocryphon of John, because again, that was something that Jesus was giving secret teachings, in that case, to John the Beloved. In this case, what we're saying is that what the gospel here is claiming is that he gave it to a guy named Didymus Judas Thomas, which is to say a guy named Jude, who is a Didymus and a Thomas, which both cases, those are the Greek and Aramaic words for twin. And so there is a guy in the canonized New Testament named Jude, who is the brother of James, who is the brother of Jesus. So this is Jesus' brother Jude. But in this case, what the Gnostics are claiming is that he's also Jesus' twin. And so possibly here, what is an idea of, there's a lot of cases in Hellenic and in Greek mythology and other mythologies where there is a divine twin and a mortal twin. So Hercules has, his mortal twin, and Castor and Pollux, there's a divine one and a mortal one. And so it may well be that Jude here is the mortal twin of Jesus. Anyway, so whatever that may be, here's how it starts. Jesus said, "Whoever discovers the interpretations of these sayings will not taste death." And so the Gnostics and the Gnostic meaning of life here is a life or death matter. If you understand this kind of knowledge, if you discover the interpretations, if you understand what this really means, if you have gnosis, you're not going to die. You're not going to die, because what you'll find out ultimately is that the seeming death that we have here in mortality is nothing, is meaningless, because the physical bodies here are simply the illusion. The real life is occurring in that spiritual life. And if you understand that, you will understand that you're going to live forever and not taste death. Jesus said, "Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find." So that part of it is similar to the canonical sayings of Jesus. But then there's an extra part of it here in not Thomas. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel, and they will reign over all. So when you find out the gnosis, you're going to be disturbed to find out this thing. You thought all of these things about your mortal life here, the life, everything that we see, you're going to realize, wait a second, we're in the Matrix. This is this is something that you're initially disturbed by when whatever Neo just realizes he's in the Matrix, but after he's disturbed, he's going to marvel, and then, by the way, he's going to have all those Matrix powers, because in a way he is now outside of what the Yaldabaoth and the kind of fake gods of this world are trying to do to control us. Here's another one, saying 3. Jesus said, "If your leaders say, look, Father's imperial rule," which is to say, this is also translated, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. "The kingdom of heaven is in the sky. Then the birds of the sky will get there first." So the kingdom of heaven, if they say it's in the sky, the birds are going to get there. If they say it's in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom of God, the Father's imperial rule, is within you, and it is outside you. So in other words, it's all over, in all this kind of way. It's not this literal place that's physical, like it's a heaven isn't just a place in the sky or in another planet or something like that. It's in fact actually spiritual. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are the poverty. So the only way, knowledge here is the only way that you're going to actually know the monad, the true Father, the living Father. And if you don't, you're going to simply live in poverty, which is to say, mortal flesh, all of this physical world that is called poverty all throughout this gospel. Okay, so the Gnostics believe, they have a solution to the problem of evil. I'm going to look at some of the other background that they are building on and rejecting to look at this kind of problem. So this is not something that only the Gnostics are worried about. It's not something that only Greeks and Westerners are worried about. Obviously, simultaneously in South Asia or in the same centuries before this, the fact that there is suffering in the world is one of the observations that the Buddha had made, and indeed the first noble truth of the Buddha is often translated, life is suffering. And so this leads to the additional truths and also indeed the path that the Buddha has, the middle path that is essentially the way to get out of suffering or to transcend suffering and have a cessation of it. We also have ideas, for example, that are coming from Greek philosophy about the problem of evil and also essentially why is there suffering, why is the world so unsatisfactory, and we've talked about it before. We've had a whole lecture on Plato's allegory of the cave from his dialogue, The Republic. And so part of the idea that Plato has is going to be, actually, you're going to it sounds kind of similar to some of the things that the Gnostics have already conveyed, which is to say, there is a real world of ideas, this world of eternal forms, a world that does not decay, a world that doesn't have all of this error and decline and death, and that our physical world, according to Plato, is a reflection of that. And that's what the allegory of the cave, essentially, the people, we are all people that are chained in a cave. We're experiencing the physical world by watching essentially a shadow puppets on a wall. We're in the matrix, we are seeing all of this 3D stuff, but in fact, this is not the real world. This is simply a reflection or a shadows of what the real world is, and if we were to go out of the cave and see the actual light, we'd be blinded by it. It's no coincidence that Plato's idea here are echoed in the Gnostics, because the Gnostics come after him and are influenced by him. So, but the Gnostics are also dealing with Scripture, and the Scripture is written earlier than Plato and has a different solution to the problem of evil embedded into it that was becoming unsatisfactory. So all of this time period is called the Second Temple period of Judaism, because in 587, the original temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. The Jewish leaders are taken into exile in Babylon, and a bunch of the other ones flee to Egypt, where they establish a diaspora community in Egypt that is still ongoing up till this time period when the Gnostics exist, as I mentioned. When those leaders are trying to ponder, why did this happen? So they're asking themselves, wait a second, if the God of Israel is God, why then did he let God's temple, the temple of Jerusalem, where all worship was to be concentrated, why did that get destroyed? The Assyrians, who said that their god, Ashur, is the true God, when they conquered the northern kingdom and destroyed Samaria, they said, well, this is because our God is God and your God wasn't God. And likewise, the Babylonians have a similar kind of general idea. Marduk is the real God, the one who's powerful here. And so they have to kind of decide, well, wait a second, why would that be? The answer, we can tell based on how the moral of the story that happens again and again and again in the text. The editors of the early biblical texts say, what was happening here is that God was punishing his people because they kept forgetting him, because they weren't consistently worshiping only real God, and they were instead continuously relapsing into paganism and worshiping all these pagan gods. And so the text is very clear about that. So in the Torah, in the Deuteronomic history, which is to say those books of the Hebrew Bible that go from the period of book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, all those books, the text follows a cycle that is really most exemplified in the book of Judges. This is a picture here of Samson, so we know that story pretty well, probably Samson and Delilah. So Samson is a judge, which is to say a ruler of one of the tribes of Israel, and he has superhuman strength but not superhuman intelligence. and one of the reasons why he has that strength is because he grows his hair long. He won't ever get a haircut. But Delilah, who is his girlfriend, is working with the enemies, the Philistines, and he keeps telling her what his weakness is, and she ties him up and things like that, all these things about, and eventually she gets it out of him, and they shave his head and things like that, and he was able to kill him. So anyway, the point of it is, though, is that what happens every single time, he's only one of the judges, and what happens every single time in the story is the Israelites forget God, they start worshiping other gods. God gets angry, so he sends, let's say, the Philistines to imprison them, enslave them all, and things like that. Then everybody remembers, oh yeah, God, So when they aren't prosperous, their hearts turn back, they're chastised, and they pray. Then God sends a deliverer, he sends a judge like Samson, like the better judges before him, like Deborah. And then they overthrow the Philistines or the Midianites or the Moabites, whoever was the bad guy of the week, or rather of the 40-year period. And then the people are prosperous again. Because they're prosperous, they then forget God And that happens again and again in a cycle, right? And so, this is like the end of the Samson. So in the end, he dies with the Philistines. So in his dying act, he massacres all the Philistines. The people remember God until the next generation, and that renews the cycle, right? So the problem with that answer, so that answer as a solution, that's a simple answer, and it would be nice sometimes. People, with the problem of evil, you always want, if you could have a simple answer, it'd be great. And so, for example, if you're in a mega church here in North America, in the United States, the answer to the problem of evil often is that God blesses good people with wealth, and the reason why you're so rich and the reason why you have a big SUV and a giant house and all those kind of things is because you're righteous. And the way you can also show that righteousness is by paying a lot of tithing to me as the pastor of the megachurch so that I can buy a new jet. And that cycle continues, and that's going to say why you're so prosperous and why you're so good. You can be very confident of the fact that you're really, really good. And so that's the prosperity gospel, and it generates a lot of wealth for megachurches, and it makes rich people be happy about why they're so good. The problem of it is if they have something terrible happen to them, then it doesn't explain why that happened, because they didn't do anything different and they kept on giving all of their tithing and all that kind of thing, and they still got cancer and died. Well, it's because it doesn't actually predict reality, any better than coin flipping predicts a particular end of the reality. You could always have a belief that my willpower alone will allow heads to happen. The prediction rate of my thesis and my belief there is about 50%, and so therefore you can believe it, but it won't be a predictor of reality. So that's also true, unfortunately, with the Deuteronomic solution to the problem of evil. Just not worshiping the pagan gods has not meant that there's been a 2,600-year run for the Jewish people with no setbacks. So in other words, Judaism, they have not been pagan this whole time, but there has continued to be negative things happen to the Jewish people, right? And so that was true way back into the Second Temple period. After the Persians were overthrown by Alexander the Great, his successors are the Seleucid kings of Syria. They come and destroy the temple, and they attack Jerusalem, and they set up within the temple, they desecrate it, they set up statues of Zeus. And so, in other words, bad things continue to happen, and the people keep getting destroyed, and in fact, even the temple gets destroyed ultimately by the Romans. Okay, so if the problem of evil is not simply caused by disobedience to God, then what? What's causing it? Simultaneously, there are other Greek philosophical thinkers, the atomists, who are reasoning this out and coming to a conclusion that many people in modern times do. So if God were willing to prevent evil, is God willing to prevent evil but is not able? Then God's not omnipotent, says Epicurus, one of these atomist philosophers at the beginning of the school of Epicureanism. If he is able but not willing, so in other words, if he's able to prevent evil but not willing to, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then why do we have evil? So this is a restatement. This is the problem of evil. Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Right? And so this is a pretty neat restatement of the problem of evil. So there are other people, though, that are simultaneously have had other solutions. And so one very prominent one in this time period is the solution posed by the Persian prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster, in creating essentially the religion of Mazdaism, what we call Zoroastrianism, one of the earliest world religions, the state religion of the Persian Empire, which is to say worship of one God who is the wise Lord, the Ahura Mazda. So Zarathustra's solution to the problem of evil is that God is good, but God is in this cosmic struggle with a very powerful force of evil, the Angri Manyu, which is essentially a much more cosmic version of the devil. So it's where this idea of a devil comes from. but is in fact actually almost as powerful as the wise Lord, but not quite. So Zoroastrianism introduces this idea that even though there is a cosmic struggle and the angry Manyu is in fact very powerful, he will eventually be defeated. The force of evil will be defeated because in the future what will come is a Saoshant, which is to say one who brings benefit. A savior is going to come in Zoroastrianism who will be at the end of the world. And then when the world is destroyed, this world of sorrows is destroyed, there will be a day of judgment, and all of the souls that have done good will go to a paradise. They'll be resurrected bodily and go to a paradise, and all of the souls who've chosen evil will be consigned to hellfire. And so all of these ideas are formulated in Zoroastrianism, and they enter into Second Temple Judaism and obviously then its successors, especially Christianity, picks up on these. Judaism doesn't keep all of these entirely or as central to it at this kind of time period. So what happens then at this kind of time period is there is a movement from what had been the prophetic tradition in First Temple Judaism to in Second Temple Judaism, a apocalyptic tradition. And so this idea that now enters into things, that there's going to be an end of the world, that there is going to be a solution to the problem of evil, is that good is eventually going to be rewarded after the destruction of the world, and evil will eventually be punished. This gives rise to all this apocalyptic traditions. And so one of the examples of this is the book of Daniel, which is an apocalyptic book. It's the very last book to be composed that actually then makes it into the canon of the Hebrew Bible. And so we can kind of see, here's an example out of the book of Daniel. And as I watched, the beast was put to death and its body destroyed and was given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and for a second time. So the beast in this case that he's seeing a vision of is the Seleucid kingdom of Syria, although it gets reinterpreted all the time as some more recent thing like the United States or whoever you want, the Soviet Union, whoever you want to have it be about to be destroyed in your current reading of the book. But anyway, there's an idea then of an apocalyptic future where evil is going to be punished. The very next verse predicts, or in a vision where Daniel sees, I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him, this is to say, the Son of Man, this Savior figure, was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So again, there's going to be this future paradise as the old world is destroyed. There'll be a coming Savior. The Savior, essentially, it's a messianic tradition, and this is where we get the word, the association of a Messiah, which had previously just meant king, but now that they are looking forward to this future Savior-style king, then it becomes this looking for a Messiah like this. And of course, Christians then interpret Jesus as fulfilling this role. And Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man throughout the canonical Gospels. Okay, so in these First Temple biblical literature, God, in the earlier part of the Bible, in books, God is actually interacting directly with prophets like Moses, and prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah wrote for God in their own name. Now, as the canon's closing in the Second Temple period, as you can't get away with that anywhere near as much, because who are you? You aren't the same as Moses. You're no Moses. People will be able to say, you're no Jeremiah. And so, as a result, the later prophets, the later writers in this period, will often write in Isaiah's name. So they'll continue to write Isaiah prophecies and say, well, Isaiah wrote this. I got another whole chapter of Isaiah right here. And so that'll happen. But another thing will happen is you will also have like a vision that will be written in the name of an ancient figure. So the book of Daniel is even an example of that. So Daniel is written in around the year, in the 2nd century anyway, BC, and it's set 400 years earlier than that, or or whatever, so it's not written contemporaneously. And so we have these figures like Daniel, Jacob, Abraham, Enoch, Adam, all of these guys, and now texts emerge in their names. And a famous one of these is the Book of Enoch. So again, it's from that period of time. It started, anyway, the earliest parts of it are maybe written in the 4th or 3rd centuries, which would be thousands of years after Enoch supposedly would have lived. Enoch is not is not a historical character, but anyway, is a figure in Genesis, from Genesis 5:21. The reason why he attracts attention is that he's just barely mentioned, and then it's mentioned he's one of the ancestors of Noah, and it's just mentioned that he walked with God and God took him. And so therefore, he's a great candidate for apocalyptic visions. And so in the Book of Enoch, and this is just the main Book of Enoch, there's actually 5 or 6 different books of Enoch. Enoch is visited by angels. He's shown visions of how the cosmos works, the names of angels, demons. They do everything. They show you where they keep the snowflakes, so that you always wonder, where'd all these snow come from that we got today? Well, they've got a whole place up there where they're keeping the snowflakes for when they need them, this kind of thing. And so we're seeing that kind of thing. In other words, back into, say, in the 3rd, 4th century, they don't have the same scientific awareness that we do, right? So it's explaining those things. But also it gives all kinds of these predictions of this future when, again, the evil is going to be punished, good is going to be rewarded. Okay. So that's a lot of background and things like that, but I want to kind of show where the Gnostics are coming from. So that when we have the origins of kind of Gnostic thought, it's coming from, again, this probably Egyptian, Greek-speaking Jewish community, and then later, especially the Christian inheritors of that. So already, always, Christianity is emerging out of the Greek-speaking and Greek-influenced Jewish tradition, as opposed to Rabbinic Judaism, which tends to reject most of that Greek influence later. And so the Gnostics here are kind of taking all of these pieces and synthesizing them together. So all of these scriptures, like the Apocryphon of John, and so many more of these are visions where we'll see essentially a Gnostic writer will talk about a character like John the Beloved, who is an important figure. They'll be writing in his name, and they'll be showing either secret teachings or often a vision that somebody has, and as they are doing the same exact thing that Enoch is doing, where he's seeing the whole cosmos. And so they're taking that apocalyptic model of the literature and synthesizing that, though, with the inheritance of the Hebrew Bible itself, so Genesis. They're often retelling these kinds of stories and explaining them given their own insights and biases. They don't think that these stories that were perfectly understood and acceptable when they were written down in an Iron Age kingdom that wasn't worried about, let's say, neighbors and things like that. They weren't thinking about their neighbors as being people. And we were only worried about themselves because they were at an earlier era of development when the stories are actually written down. Now these are being retold, but in the place of the previous ideas, essentially Platonic spiritualism is providing the whole intellectual mechanism and apparatus. And so they've taken Middle Platonism and propped it up inside there in order to animate the whole thing. Okay. So how do these guys then fit in with early Christianity? So when we look at the way Christian history is told traditionally, it's generally speaking told as if Jesus is, it's told in this order, so we tell history in this historical order, as opposed to the order starting from when the thing is actually written. So we'll get to why this is a backwards way to tell it. So Jesus is a guy who's living in the 30s of the Common Era, AD, in Galilee. According to the way we tell the story, he founds a church. He's recognized as the Messiah, which is, in Greek, that's Christ, right? So Christian, here's where we're getting that. Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection. He's executed by the Romans, and then the risen Christ is said to appear to his disciples, who give all the testimony that Christ is alive. So then the Christian apostles then go forth, they spread the good news or gospel to other Jews, and then fairly quickly thereafter to all the world, so to all of the Gentiles, which is to say the Greek-speaking converts. And every one of those guys then gets martyred or through persecution. But prior to being martyred, all of the apostles found churches, which are to say Christian communities in all the cities of the Greek-speaking Roman Empire and even the West. And those are then have bishops that are appointed to oversee them. And so therefore, there's a line that goes directly from Jesus to the bishops, who are the people that are in charge of these different communities. So that's how it's told. The narrative is obviously promoted by the bishops. As you can imagine, this is a very pro-bishop kind of narrative. And so these are the people that found themselves kind of leading or as the leaders of the mainstream Christian churches in the 2nd and 3rd centuries when the texts and everything like that are being compiled and canonized. The Christian story is being kind of put together. And so the narrative definitely explains why the bishops are in charge, and it also traces their authority through apostolic succession back to Jesus. So the way the bishops would draw the diagram of all of this, there's one Catholic and Orthodox church. It's been led by bishops, and then everybody who doesn't conform to it, like the Gnostics, are simply breakoffs of this thing that has gone all the way back. So there's these Ebionite guys, there's these Marcionites, there's Gnostics, but they are not part of the main line. And so because we're writing the story here, by adding these things behind it, in other words, Jesus and so on and so forth, leading up to apostles, the apostolic succession, it's the perspective of the guys who won, right? And so history, as we always say, is written by the winners, and that, or at least history is won by those who write the history down anyway. But it's almost always a lot more complicated than that. And this is going to be true here too. So early Christianity, almost all scholars, all historians who look into it agree, is not this one of simple a one-line thing that where Jesus started it and it continued to where it is, but rather that there were multiple early Christianities that emerge when we first have any text about them, that they already have multiple variants. And in fact, each of our earliest texts is written by a different Christian community that is in some cases very serious opposition to each other. And so some of these groups are the Ebionites, which is to say these groups of Jewish Christians who still think it's critical and critically important to live Jewish law, to observe Jewish law. And on the other end of that are the Marcionites. These are the guys who are following a very important early leader named Marcion, who rejects essentially the Hebrew Bible and the law and anything about it, and instead is trying to have an almost entirely, let's say, Hellenized version of Christianity. And then there's the guys who are going to win, who historians retroactively call the proto-Orthodox, because they're going to evolve into the Orthodox Catholic, in other words, the main line of Christianity. And they have this kind of middle ground, which is that no, Christians don't have to obey Jewish law. We don't have to keep kosher. But there's some things that we should probably keep doing, like the Ten Commandments and things like that. Mostly, obviously, not the Sabbath, because we're going to be doing Sunday instead of Saturday and this kind of a thing. And so they instead their position is that we don't throw the Old Testament away, but we don't read it literally. We read it typologically, which is to say every one of these things that's happening in the Old Testament is a story of and a prediction of the Christian gospel. So the whole idea of, for example, crossing the Red Sea or crossing the Jordan River is that essentially the people, to become set apart, to become the true Israel, to become that, they had to be baptized. And even the flood is also a baptism typology. The whole reason why the world had to have the old world destroyed, it's not so much a story about literally killing everybody, but in the same way that Christians understood that the old person is dead when they go into the waters of baptism, and a new person is alive in Christ when they come out. That's what that story is now typologically signifying, as opposed to worrying about it in any kind of literal interpretation. Okay, so I've shown this. Oh, go ahead.
I have questions about it. During the same 2nd century, also another dualistic religion, the Manichaeism,
Yes.
has emerged. What is the effect to Gnosticism to them?
Yeah. So the question is, so there's another world religion that's emerging a little after Gnosticism. So there is a Persian prophet named Mani who is synthesizing Christianity, and specifically Gnostic Christianity and Zoroastrianism, and it becomes a world religion. And so what I'd say is probably the answer is that Mani is specifically influenced by Gnostic Christianity. And so when Manichaeism, which is his religion, emerges, and it poses quite a major threat to Christianity, it's the main world religion that is Christianity's, let's say, rival before the emergence of Islam. And in fact, it becomes the state religion of some of the Central Asian states, and it survives on in China and places like that until, anyway, the Middle Ages. Manichaeism, I would say, that's one of the surviving holdovers of the Gnostics. So as we'll see, the people in the Roman Empire, the Orthodox, are able to stamp out Gnosticism, but Gnosticism continues on in other forms through the other world religions. So I've shown this chart in previous times when we had a lecture on lost Christianities, and I won't do it in too much detail, but as opposed to the way the bishops are telling the story where everything just starts in a direct line from Jesus to the proto-Orthodox, I've argued that probably, in fact, actually, the group here that we talked about, the Ebionites, who are the Christians who are actually observing the law, have probably a little bit more of a direct back channel or whatever. They're more directly connected to the original group that Jesus and his followers and his brothers specifically found, because we have some evidence that this group called the Poor of Jerusalem is afterwards led by Jesus' brother James, and then later by James's brother Jude. Continues to exist in Jerusalem until Jerusalem's destroyed by the Romans, and thereafter is continuing to exist in exile, but within kind of the broader Palestine area, until finally it's extinguished by the state religion of the Roman Empire, because the Ebionites are deemed to be, in the 4th and 5th centuries, they're deemed to be heretics. And so, so this group ultimately loses out, but it may have a more direct connection originally, as opposed to the proto-Orthodox, who really are built on this church that Paul founds among the Greek converts. So anyway, but there's also this other group that we want to talk about here. This is the focus that we've been doing. So how are the Marcionites, how are the Gnostics, and other groups related? So in the same way that I made that chart before, and it kind of looked like maybe Gnostics are a break-off of Marcionites, and there may be another break-off of Valentinians. Actually, what's going to be probably more the case is that it's simply also very confusing and complex how all these different groups relate to each other. So there are different groups of these kinds of Christian dualists who have Gnosticizing ideas. And so there's, on the one hand, these Marcionites, the followers of this guy Marcion. There's Gnostics, who I was quoting at the beginning from this Apocryphon of John, that have this very elaborated mythology that's a little different from Marcion's, and is different later from Valentinian, who also essentially has another group, and his group spreads and splits into different factions. So what I'm going to suggest is that that although some scholars just like to draw a circle around let's say the Gnostics proper and say, well, this is really what we mean when we're referring to Gnostics. Some also just think of Gnostics as a type, and so that the word can be used more broadly to describe some of these other Gnosticizing groups that may well be, let's say they're influencing each other anyway and related to each other. And one of the reasons why I think that actually makes a bunch of sense is that when we get the main Gnostic library that we have, so this library that has been discovered in the 20th century, the Nag Hammadi library, it turns out actually that all of these are all mixed up together. And so it's not that these guys were only Marcionites or that these guys were only Gnostics proper or only Valentinians, but rather they have texts from all of the groups. And so it may well be that people who have this kind of interest are picking and choosing from the texts, and they may well be, in terms of their own personal practice, they're only doing, let's say, the Valentinian initiations or something like that, but in any event, they're finding them all interesting. So we've talked about, we've taken quotes from it, but one of the interesting things that we've had and our ability to get to know the Gnostics and why I was able to actually, at the outset, give you guys like the central Gnostic secret is that we really have now the secrets, right? So we really have the texts because there were 12 codices that were found buried in a jar near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. And so it's near where Christian monasteries of St. Pachomius were, and it may well be that monastery or those monasteries had this collection in their archives. It was ultimately all reassembled, and it's now in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. It's all been translated, and people can have access to all of these. So what happens is there's 12 codices, which is to say books, but then within each codex there's actually multiple individual book or texts that are kind of all together. And so there's actually 52 tractates total. They're all of them written in Coptic, which is the Egyptian language, but it's this Egyptian language that has, as it's been written in Greek, because the Greeks have been in charge of Egypt and Alexandria for centuries at this time, and then again in the Roman period, they continued to speak or write in Greek. So Egyptian continues to be used as a language until Islam conquers Egypt, and then slowly Arabic displaces it as a language that's somewhat related, and so therefore, as opposed to Greek and Latin, those didn't have any sway, whereas Arabic has displaced it. And so now Coptic, or the Egyptian language, has been retained as the liturgical language of the Christian community of Egypt. So the Coptic texts, when we go through them, we now have them translated into English, but anyway, they're also available to be studied in Coptic. Every one of them is a translation of Greek originals. Some of them are better and worse, and there's multiple scribes, and so different texts, and essentially it's a whole library. It's not any one person who made these all together. So the library is a collection of a person or a group of people that are interested in Gnosticism, but like I say, they aren't all Gnostic in origin. So the Sixth Codex, for example, contains what is described anyway as a very poor Coptic translation of Plato's Republic. So we can see why already, I think you can see why Plato's Republic and Platonism would have the same interest to people who are also Gnostic. And one of the things that happens in antiquity is if you have a text that you like, you have to make a copy of it if you're going to have your own copy anyway, and maybe in terms of the Republic, you've got to be translating it out of Greek into Coptic anyway. And so as you're doing that, there's always the temptation, since you don't just have a Xerox machine, there's always the temptation to simply also write additional stuff in. Or maybe what happened was that originally somebody had written a translation, and then somebody had written a lot of glosses or notes that are really good that are right next to it. And so what will happen when you make the copy is you'll maybe just write the one thing and then you'll write the note, and so then the text changes as you go. And so this certainly happened with this copy of the Republic, which becomes much more of a Gnostic Republic as a result. Another example of that's just even within the library that we can see how this kind of textual growth goes is that there is a philosophical text called Eugnosis the Blessed. And so what ends up happening then is you take that completely, let's say we now think of that as secular, but anyway, this philosophical text, and then it's broken up into sections by somebody, and then in another part of the library, those have been relabeled as the Sophia of Jesus Christ. And so the same exact text and statements now is put into the mouth of holy wisdom. and the holy wisdom that's emanating from Christ. So now it's become a completely Christianized text, even though the text itself is the same as this, what the philosopher has said. And so we can see how some of these Gnostic texts even arise that way. So other texts have gone these similar Gnostic redaction, and I argued at the beginning that in fact the Gospel of Thomas is probably one of those where we have a sayings Gospel of Jesus that has been Gnosticized by adding those extra sections. Okay, so I just want to give one last other taste of this, since we have this kind of really amazing library now. So there's a text or a poem that's called "The Thunder, the Perfect Mind," which is in a long kind of poem that's in the voice of a female speaker, which is probably holy wisdom. And the text mirrors all of these I am statements, like we have in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is saying I am, and when he does that, he is also mirroring God in the book of Exodus, who says I am when he's asked what his name is by Moses. So here's a quotation from Thunder, the Perfect Mind. "Do not be ignorant of me anywhere or any time. Be on your guard. Don't be ignorant of me. For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the second one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the bride and the bridegroom. It is my husband who begot me." So we can kind of see in this, what we maybe don't expect from, like say, other Christian texts, that there is now a place that the Gnostics have in Scripture itself for the feminine divine, right? So holy wisdom is a female figure, and one of the things that she here is expressing are these kind of Gnostic paradoxes, right? And so these are also, we can maybe even see as a paradox that that women sometimes also face in society. So there is this idea of, on the one hand, you're being viewed as wife and virgin, this idea of holy and whore. So, "Hear me, you hearers, and learn of my words, you who know me. I am the hearing that is attainable to everything. I am the speech that cannot be grasped. I am the name of the sound and the sound of the name. I am the sign of the letter and the designation of the division." So, so these are kinds of imponderable paradoxes. This is the kind of thing that Gnostic texts are all full of, because of the idea of it is you start with paradoxes that are ungraspable, and you go to further and further abstractions of thought, so that you can ultimately achieve the intellectual union with the one, the monad, right? Okay, but I was going to suggest here also one of the things that when the Gnostic Gospels were first found, there was a thinking, well, maybe the Gnostics actually represented a place where, let's say, we could get more female voices, because female figures, Eve and Mary Magdalene and Eve's daughter and Holy Wisdom and other female portions of the divine are portrayed in bigger roles. And so what we're going to see also next week, I think, when we are doing our lecture on the great goddess and on the female divine, unfortunately, is that just because there may be a role for the female divine, and indeed women in the divine mythology, it doesn't necessarily mean that women in the communities are in any kind of a better role. And so it may well be that you may have this prominent role of a great goddess, and yet you will still have quite sexist lived experience for the people who are part of that religious cult. And so one of the most unfortunate, for me, I think, verses in the Gospel of Thomas is this one here. So Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary Magdalene here, one of the disciples, leave us, for women are not worthy of life. And so that's a bad thing coming out of Peter's mouth. Yeah, exactly. And so, but anyway, Jesus' answer here, though, is like, he's not sticking up in the right way, right? So, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she may too become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack, but essentially this is one of the things that unfortunately we see the closer that we look at kind of these Gnostic texts. So even though we have this idea that both, let's say, wisdom is female, nevertheless wisdom is actually what caused the whole problem, of the material world in the first place. If we remember that in the myth, it was wisdom doing things without the consent of her consort and without consent of the spirit, the male consort, that caused everything to go awry. So that's already a problematic, not necessarily pro-feminine viewpoint. Likewise, when we saw that first emanation, forethought, which is sometimes described as the womb of creation in Gnostic texts, and so therefore has these female divine qualities. Nevertheless, that forethought is also sometimes described as thrice male. So not just male, but like super male and all those kind of things. And so the idea of it seems to be, and also expressed here, is that there is this very big idea in Gnosticism about balance between the genders, and the genders being in those aeons, male and female components. And indeed, in the original creation story, God creates humanity, male and female, together in God's image. But then there's the second creation story where Eve is created out of a rib from Adam. And so this is essentially getting to the Aristotelian negative impression of gender, which is that there is one type of human that is human, of which then males are the main type and females are the inferior quality of. And so therefore the males need to have the female element restored to them in order to be wholly integrated in Gnosticism. But in this case, as we're seeing here with Mary, females need to get up a level in the perceived hierarchy of order as far as the Gnostics are concerned in order to achieve full humanity. And so no matter how much we would like to have found in the Gnostics, let's say, people who embrace wisdom being a feminine quality and maybe embracing the feminine divine, and so maybe we might find them being wise, they don't always get to the values that we might want them to have, as ancient people are wont to do. So, how did they end? What's the fall of Gnostics? So unlike the Ebionites we mentioned, those Christians who follow Jewish law, who maintain their own separate communities, for most of the existence of Gnostic Christians, they operated within traditional Christian communities. Like I was kind of mentioning, you might have your own little Gnostic study group that has got this secret knowledge that is initiating, let's say, the people who you think in the group are smart enough to be in the group with you. In his own lifetime, Valentinus, who is this great Christian theologian who is presenting or actually Christianizing even further so many of these Gnostic ideas, he is not considered a heretic in his lifetime, but soon after that, as the proto-Orthodox bishops are kind of getting control of everything and they're taking control, and especially then when the church becomes the state religion of Christianity, these guys strongly condemn Gnosticism. So Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon here, he writes a very severe book that he writes that's called Against Heresies, and he says, especially including Gnosticism so-called, he's trying to root that out. And so probably then, the whole reason why we have all of these texts from Nag Hammadi is that the monks there appreciated them. Somebody hoped, when all of this kind of persecution of Gnostic ideas, when that all dies down, I don't want to burn these now because I love these books, and so hopefully, this will all die down and we'll bury them and I'll come back and get them when the coast is clear, kind of thing. But ultimately what ends up happening anyway in the Roman Empire is that the coast never is clear. And so ultimately, Gnosticism is eliminated. There's kind of a period of time when the Gnostics are kind of kicked out of the traditional churches, and they have, in some cases, their own churches. But at a certain point, those churches are also shut down, and Gnosticism is extinguished from the Roman Empire. And so that's the fall of Gnosticism. Questions, Elizabeth?
Yeah, is this work? Yes, it is. I read Elaine Padgell's book many, many years ago.
Yes.
And I can't say I remember very much, but I remember that she said that Gnosticism really couldn't, it couldn't defeat, it couldn't take over from mainstream Christianity. It was too hard. To be a Gnostic, you had to have the time, which meant the money, to do the studying, and you had, I suppose, to have the brains and the temperament to do this. It was always a small group. It had to be people who knew who had esoteric knowledge. It couldn't spread out to everybody. And for Christianity to become what it is, it had to be available, had to be accessible to everybody, and Gnosticism never was.
Right. Yeah. So now I think that's a very good insight too. So that the idea of it is, how did these bishops essentially take very kind of sophisticated? Ultimately, when they formulate their idea of Trinity, which is nevertheless going to be very inclusive of all kinds of the same kind of Platonic and Aristotelian ideas of philosophy and cosmology and things like that, although just not the same formulation and not as bald-facedly as the Gnostics have in terms of their Platonism. How do they then convey this very tough classical philosophy and science to the masses, to all of the peasants that are going to now have to be Christians? And so the way they do it is they formulate creeds. And so at a certain point, when you're saying like the Nicene Creed and things like that, and you're saying that you believe in one God and you believe in three persons and you believe that Christ is fully human and fully divine, you have this whole thing that you've memorized that is a very complicated, it's expressing very complicated philosophical ideas, but you just don't have to know anything about it or understand what it means at all because you've memorized it. And so that's how they were able to work it out, I think. Yeah.
I'd just like to share my understanding of two words for knowledge in ancient Greek. This is not, I'm not talking about the implications for Gnosticism, but just for the more general sense of what knowledge is, since that is concerned Gnosticism in general sense. So there are two words in Greek that I know. One is gnosis, of course, and the other is episteme.
Yeah.
So just you mentioned Plato. So when Plato asked the question, what is knowledge, in the Theaetetus, he used the word episteme. He didn't use the word gnosis.
Right.
So that's interesting. So episteme, in the context of Plato, certainly refers to sort of an argument that you posit a definition of virtue or courage, whatever you're discussing, and then you examine the definition.
Yeah.
And then you see if it's general enough, and if it's not general enough, then it's deficient in some respect, then you reshape it or reject it and come up with another one. So that's sort of like a disputing the merits of a definition. That would be epistemology.
Yeah.
The other one, gnosis, as found in the Greek expression, for example, gnosti soton, know thyself.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing about gnosis, gnosken, means to know, means to recognize and to be acquainted with. And the root of that is, the English word narrative comes from that root. You just eliminate the G and you have the N, so narrative. So narrative is another form of knowledge, which has not to do with so much as defining a term and then defending the definition, but telling the story.
Yeah.
And I think in your definition there's sort of, in your presentation rather, you can see that at least these two types of knowledge were present.
Yeah.
And the third actually is not from the Greek, but from the Bible, since that's also part of the discussion too.
Sure.
To know.
Yes.
Judea means, Adam and Eve, it's sort of sexual intimacy.
Yeah.
And so to be one with the monad, I think, is that sort of knowledge.
Yeah.
So you have these sort of three tonalities of knowing that are present in this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That added a lot. I appreciate it. Valerie.
Now, as far as I know, Saint Augustine, in his early days, was a Manichaean.
That's correct.
Right. Yeah. I'm wondering what present-day scholarship sees as the possible influence on the Gnostic elements in Manichaeanism on his later theology, including his idea of the elect, which would be very parallel, I would imagine, to the let's say those who have the largest portion of light among the Gnostics, who were seen as a type of elect, and also his seeming denigration of the material and the physical,
Right.
including possibly women, sexuality, all of that. So I'm wondering what present-day scholarship sees as how much of an influence there seems to be, and also how that influence has played out later in Protestantism, which very much sourced Augustine for its theology and even unto, let's say, evangelicism. So
Yes. No, I think that scholars find that because Augustine is so important to Latin Christianity and as opposed to Greek Christianity, and then afterwards to Protestantism that emerges out of Latin Christianity, that in fact there's all kinds of almost direct doses of Manichaean ideas that make their way into Augustine, because he is before he formulates his way of being able to intellectualize and understand, decide he's prepared to be a Christian. He has previously studied Plotinus, so he's studied Neoplatonism, and he's also been a Manichae. And so as a result of that, he has both of those kind of threads in him, and that he emphasizes those kind of things more. I would say in terms of the not liking sex part, that's for whatever reason. So we didn't make a lot of emphasis on it, although we just barely skirted on the idea of the Hebrew for to know as a euphemism in the Old Testament for sexual intimacy, in addition to having that kind of knowledge. And there is that kind of a sense in both in Plato and in the Gnostics, where the imagery of the lover and erotic love does play into kind of the mystical union that you can have with the monad, with the one. Nevertheless, the Gnostics are and Plato too, are very anti-material world, and so they're very anti-sex and procreation. And certainly the Manichaees are also quite against that, and especially let's say the later dualists that make their way into the West, so the Cathars, where the elect are essentially swearing off procreation, because you do not want to have any more sources of light, sparks of light imprisoned in bodies. So even though they are kind of in that way, nevertheless, that's happening in a lot of Greek philosophy, and also in mainline Christianity too. So Paul and everybody, they're all quite ambiguous at best about sex. They're like, well, it's not good, but if you have to get married first, then it's okay, then that kind of a thing, as opposed to it being very good. Augustine isn't as worried about sex as his number one thing that he's against. He spends, like in his Confessions, he spends the bulk of his whole life actually having a lover that he's consistently with, that he only puts off when he gets old enough that he doesn't have sexual temptation anymore, and then he's kind of over it. So he isn't as I don't think he's as worried about it as that in terms of the sexual part of it, but in terms of some of these other ideas about an elect and fallen and those kind of things, I think those definitely pull through.